الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh, dear brothers and sisters, and dear comrades. For today's lecture, for today's khutbah, I would like to talk about a bit of a different matter than the previous lectures. I would like to talk about an historical event inspired by the fact that where I live in Belgium, in Flanders specifically, tomorrow, the 11th of July, will be the Flemish regional holiday, which by Flemish nationalists, of course, is known as and separatists, is known as the Flemish national holiday, expressing, of course, their desires and hopes for an independent Flanders and the split of Belgium as a nation. I would like to talk today about the historical event that was the start of this so-called holiday, as well as the actual class struggle that it really was, the real content of the battle that was the start of this commemoration on the 11th of July, as well as the historical revisionism and rewriting of history that has happened to this occasion on behalf, of course, of the ruling class in some sort of a plot that is typical for the ruling classes to ensure that the combative spirit, the spirit of struggle for the lower classes and for the proletariat will be extinguished in favor of a nationalist and chauvinistic way of looking at history. Tomorrow, the 11th of July, is an important day in the country in which I live, especially in the region of Flanders. It's a holiday that has been translated into some sort of a national holiday for this region. In many ways, it has become a day of celebration and a day of political manifestation by extremist right-wing Flemish nationalists and fascist organizations and politicians. In the romanticized rewriting of history, the 11th of July has become somewhat of a medieval version of the Flanders Fields story of World War I. Some sort of a romanticized look on history that has been used eagerly by Flemish nationalists and separatists. Even more moderate parties in Flanders, they like to participate in these festivities and aim to give people in Belgium, in the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium, as some sort of a distinct national identity and pretend that this national identity has existed for centuries. In reality, July the 11th, in the year 1302 AD, was the day of the so-called Battle of the Golden Spurs, which was a decisive battle taking place in the period of the Franco-Flemish War of the early 1300s. Admittedly, this day was of great historical importance, with significant repercussions for military history, as well as for socio-economic history and political history of Europe, but not for the reason that these nationalist parties would have us believe. And on that, I would like to elaborate right now. In reality, this battle was not at all a clash of civilizations. It was not a nationalist uprising of Flemish nationalists, Flemish patriots against the French-speaking Francophone elite or Francophone inhabitants of Wallonia, or of France itself, which all these things that are often claimed by fascist pundits and propaganda and Flemish separatist demagogues is in fact a 19th century fabrication that finds its roots in the romanticist rewriting of history that happened in many places in Europe, especially in countries such as Germany, as well as in France and in Great Britain in the 19th century. They like to pretend that this was a battle that was part of an eternal conflict between the Dutch-speaking Flemish and the French-speaking Walloons of Belgium. It has often been used in order to fan the flames of separatism, of racial hatred, and of communitarian conflict and violence, with the goal, of course, of breaking up Belgium into ethno-states, Flanders and Wallonia. In reality, the Franco-Flemish War and the Battle of the Golden Spurs that took place in the marshes near the city of Kortrijk in 1302 was in reality a complex mix of a feudal war, a trade dispute, and most of all a class war. It was a class conflict. Because Flanders at that point, first and foremost, was not the Flanders as we know it now. Flanders, as we know it now, the place where I live, is used as a term, as a blanket term, to talk about all the Dutch-speaking parts of Belgium. All the places in the north, from the sea all the way to the province of Limburg. The latter one being my home province. In reality, back then, originally Flanders was used as the name of a feudal fiefdom that consisted mostly of the area around Ghent and Bruges, as well as northern France, what we know now as the areas of Lille, Douai and Dunkirk, as well as the present-day Dutch province of Zeeland. All of this territory together was called the County of Flanders. This means that the most important Flemish city nowadays, for example, Antwerp, was never part of this historical County of Flanders. It means that the entire eastern part of present-day Dutch-speaking Belgium was never part of Flanders. Antwerp, for example, was part of the Duchy of Brabant, whereas Limburg was part of the Prince-Bishopric of Liège, which was actually tied to the German Empire, to the Holy Roman Empire, rather than to the French Kingdom. Returning now to Flanders, medieval, historical Flanders. Historical Flanders had a very special role in late medieval Europe. Far from being a typical feudal realm, this was actually some sort of a proto-capitalist society, a sort of mercantile capitalist society. The majority of people in Flanders lived in or near the cities, which was very atypical for feudal Europe. These people living there in the cities, they lived off of trade, craftsmanship, and of course of agriculture around the cities. The County of Flanders was also much freer than most of the feudal fiefdoms in Europe were, especially when you compare it to the other parts in the Kingdom of France. And yet officially Flanders was still part of the Kingdom of France, and it accepted the suzerainty of the King of France, be it with significant autonomy and significant de facto independence. For centuries, the County of Flanders had enjoyed far-reaching autonomy, had ruled most of its matters internally, and had by the end of the 13th century become one of the richest areas in medieval Europe, and potentially even one of the richest areas in the world in the early 14th century. It boasted vibrant commerce in bustling cities that were some of the biggest cities and the most wealthy cities in all of Europe, for example Bruges, Ghent and Ypres. However, in 1297, the French king Philip IV, spurred on by the prospects of annexing the rich mercantile cities and putting it immediately under control of the French crown, decided to basically withdraw, take away the autonomy of Flanders. When this was met by conflict, he invaded the country entirely and swept away the Flemish army and put the entire area under the direct governorship of a French royal governor. The Count, Gwyde van Dampierre, was imprisoned by the French as well as most of his family, and the entire country was subjected to massive feudal levies, feudal taxation, as was at that time very common in most of France and most of medieval Europe. To make matters worse, upon annexing Flanders almost entirely, the French decided to slowly roll back some of the taxation that already existed, but only the taxation that existed for the patricians, the rich mercantile class, the upper class, basically some sort of proto-capitalist merchants. These very rich merchants, as well as the Flemish nobility, were exempted from taxes, were exempted from heavy taxation, whereas the peasants and the craftsmen, the urban craftsmen and the urban poor in the Flemish cities, bore the brunt of the taxation and were pushed to the brink of poverty. Of course, this proved to be an explosive cocktail. It proved to be a fatal mistake on behalf of the French king. By 1302, Flanders was basically cut in half, was cut in two sides. You had the patrician side that was backed by the French monarchy, the rich merchants and the nobility, and you had the plebeian side, so to say, by the side of the urban poor, the side of the peasants, of the urban craftsmen, and they were supported, paradoxically enough, supported by the Count of Flanders and some part of Flemish nobility. Now, the reason why the Count of Flanders supported this peasant rebellion was not so much out of the goodness of his heart or out of class consciousness and decision that he wanted to join the poor and join the proletarians, but more like, of course, because the fact that the Count was being imprisoned by the French and his power had been massively eroded by the recent French invasion. On July the 11th, the so-called Flemish army consisted out of civic militias, peasants, craftsmen, guild members, and urban poor faced off against a heavily armored French army. While both forces numbered around 8,000 people, the French army numbered no less than 2,500 heavily armored cavalry, heavily armored knights. The cream of the crop of the French nobility, of French aristocracy, and of Flemish aristocracy was fielded against this peasant army with the idea that this peasant rebellion would very quickly be destroyed and quashed. As mentioned before, this was a class conflict, not so much a nationalist struggle. This was shown by the fact that the Flemish were supported by troops that came from present-day Germany and troops that came from Namur, which is now deep in French-speaking Wallonia. It's a French-speaking city that supported the Flemish peasant uprising. On the other side, troops from Dutch-speaking Antwerp actually joined the French armies in order to join the nobility of France and Flanders against the peasants that were standing against them at the Battle of the Golden Spurs on the 11th of July. Through the careful use of the environment and great tactical maneuvering, something happened that at that point in time, 1302, was considered nearly impossible. The peasant army, consisting exclusively and only out of infantry, defeated the French army of aristocracy, of nobility, and of armed horse-ridden knights. This was a massive blow to the knights and the men-at-arms of the French crown. The Flemish troops, the peasant forces, they used close-rank tactics. They used large spiked maces known as goedendags, and they used pikemen. And of course took very careful use of the very marshy, boggy terrain that was located near Kortrijk, in which the heavily armored knights and their horses very quickly and easily got stuck. This battle marked one of the first times in history, at least in the history of Europe, one of the first times ever that an infantry army defeated an army of knights. This was a battle that was, in that regard, of the same extent as the earlier battle in Scotland, the Battle of Stirling, in which a similar feat was perpetrated. A similar feat was gained by William Wallace and his Scottish army when they defeated the English knights that tried to invade Scotland at that time. Indeed, the Battle of the Golden Spurs, as it was called, played an important and pivotal role in the history of both military and social history in Europe. Contrary to the norms of the time, for example, the peasants and the craftsmen refused to take aristocrats prisoner. They have refused to take these noble knights as prisoner in order to sell them for a ransom back to their noble families. In fact, what happened in reality is that these knights were killed just like any other ordinary soldier would have been murdered. They were killed in the field of battle. No mercy was shown, depending only on the nobility of their lineage. For the Flemish peasants, for the craftsmen, for the urban poor, they did not recognize, they did not accept the back then widely accepted idea that a person was worth more if he was of noble blood. The Flemish peasants cut them down just like they cut down any normal soldier. The Battle of the Golden Spurs was named that way because hundreds of golden spurs used by the knights to spur on their horses in the battle were collected after the battle from the dead knights and hung in a nearby chapel as a sort of victory. The Pope, Bonifacius VIII, the Pope in Rome at that time, was woken up by frantic messengers a few days after the battle, telling him that an historical, unseen occasion had happened, the defeat of a noble aristocratic army at the hands of simple commoners, simple peasants, craftsmen, and traders. The battle was one of the heralds of change that would determine the rest of the 14th century, the rise of mercantile capitalism, the rise of the cities of Europe, the rise of the urban freedmen instead of the servitude and the serfdom that was so common in medieval Europe. Peasant uprisings after the Battle of the Golden Spurs would see more and more victories against feudal lords because they learned their lessons and they decided to use the terrain, use guerrilla tactics, and use very smart tactical maneuvering and infantry strategies towards which the heavily armored knights had no real response. However, in the last 200 years, despite the fact that leading historians, including leading Belgian and Flemish historians like Henri Pirenne, despite the fact that leading historians have constantly been emphasizing the class conflict, the class nature of this conflict, that it was a conflict between the poor and the rich, between the exploited and the exploiters, between the oppressed and the oppressors. In the last 200 years, ever since the foundation of Belgium as a country, what has happened is that slowly but surely the class nature of this conflict has been swept aside in favor of nationalist, chauvinistic revisionism. Flemish nationalists will now claim, as they will do tomorrow no doubt, that the Battle of the Golden Spurs was a battle by heroic Flemish Dutch-speaking nationalists who defended their race and their people against the Francophone invaders that came from abroad. This is not true. This is something that is a rewriting of history that only serves the interests of the Flemish upper class, of the exploiters, of the ruling class of Flanders, and in fact the ruling class of Belgium as a whole. What these Flemish nationalists also fail to mention is that Flanders never even fought for independence. Independence was never the goal, nor did they ever achieve independence. In reality, Flanders actually suffered several defeats after 1302 in this battle against the French, and in 1305 they eventually signed a peace treaty that confirmed Flanders in its status as an autonomous part of the French kingdom, but not as an independent country. Flanders never was an independent country, no matter how much Flemish nationalists would like to pretend otherwise. The Flemish cities eventually had to pay heavy taxes and reparations to the French crown in order to keep and safeguard their freedom and autonomy. Another thing that Flemish nationalists will never say is that eventually, only a good 25 years later, the count of in that time, the later counts and the Flemish nobility would side completely and unequivocally with the French crown and the French nobility against the peasants, against the craftsmen, and against the poor of Flanders itself. In 1328, something that they don't like to talk about, in 1328 another war broke out, another uprising broke out, in which Flemish peasants and Flemish craftsmen faced off against the French troops. But in that time, that count back then decided unequivocally to join the French side, because this again was a class conflict in which the count decided that it was better for his position and his wealth and well-being if he joined with the French oppressors of the French absolute monarchy. In this battle in 1328, the Battle of Kassel, the revolutionaries under the leadership of peasant revolutionary leader Zannekin were soundly defeated and massacred by the forces of the Count of Flanders, by these Flemish knights and Flemish nobles that, according to the Flemish rewriting of history, were always on the side of the ordinary Flemish people, showing once again that the reality of the situation was more complex than contemporary political pundits and nationalist politicians would like us to believe. Dear brothers and sisters, I would like to conclude with this. It is important for us to keep fighting against revisionism and historical rewriting. It is important to bring back the memory and the commemoration of the actual class struggles, because, as Karl Marx said, the history of humanity so far has been constantly and permanently the history of class struggle between the oppressed and the oppressors. The Battle of the Golden Spurs, as a commemoration, has been ruined and destroyed by revisionism, by outright fabrication and nationalist falsification. Just like the occasions of many real-life historical revolutionary events has been tainted by rewriting of history and nationalist falsifications that were spurred on by the ruling classes of various countries around the world. It is up to us, the defenders of truth and justice. It is up to us to ensure that the lies and the falsehood are separated from the facts about our past. It is very important to commemorate the past events and the deeds of past generations, the deeds of our ancestors. But it is just as important to ensure that these deeds aren't misused for the profit of those who would seek to impress us. It is just as important to ensure that the commemoration happens in a good, righteous, and just way.